In the winter of 1824, 17 families in Hadley, Massachusetts, vanished without a trace within 3 months. Not murdered, not kidnapped, they simply abandoned their homes, their livelihoods, and their identities, walking into the wilderness as if compelled by an invisible force. The local constabulary found no signs of violence, no evidence of coercion, yet entire bloodlines disappeared overnight, leaving behind only their belongings, and a single name whispered by terrified neighbors: Professor Ezekiel Drummond. What the authorities discovered in his private study would challenge everything they understood about the human mind, and what they chose to bury would haunt Massachusetts for generations. The science of 1824 had no name for what Drummond had become, no explanation for his methods, and no way to comprehend the systematic destruction of human will he had perfected. Before we continue with the story of Professor Ezekiel Drummond and the families who walked willingly into oblivion, make sure to subscribe to never miss stories like this, and let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. We love hearing from our audience across America. The truth of what happened in Hadley that winter would remain buried in official records for decades, dismissed as mass hysteria by a science too primitive to understand the darkest capabilities of human manipulation. Hadley, Massachusetts in 1824 was a thriving agricultural community of 800 souls, nestled in the fertile Connecticut River Valley, where tobacco and corn grew tall in the rich alluvium. The town had been established in 1659 by Puritan settlers, and by the early 19th century it had evolved into one of western Massachusetts' most prosperous farming communities. The main thoroughfare, our King Street, was lined with well-maintained colonial houses, their white clapper siding and black shutters reflecting the orderly prosperity that defined New England village life. The town boasted 2 churches: the original Congregationalist meeting house, with its towering white spire, and a newer Methodist chapel that served the growing population of Irish and German immigrants who had arrived to work the expanding farms. Reverend Moses Kingsley had presided over the Congregationalist church for 23 years, delivering sermons that balanced Calvinist theology with the practical needs of a farming community. His counterpart, Reverend Patrick O'Brien, ministered to the Catholic immigrants with a gentleness that had gradually won acceptance even from Hadley's more traditional Protestant families. The heart of the community's intellectual life was the Hadley Academy, a prestigious preparatory school housed in a grand 3-story brick building on Elm Street, built in 1798 with funds donated by the prominent merchant families of the Connecticut Valley. The academy drew students from across New England, preparing the sons of wealthy merchants, politicians, and landowners for entrance to Harvard, Yale, and Dartmouth. The school's reputation for academic excellence had made it a source of tremendous pride for the community, and families competed fiercely for their sons to gain admission. Professor Ezekiel Drummond had arrived in Hadley during the autumn of 1821, carrying with him a leather traveling case filled with letters of recommendation that spoke of his extraordinary insight into the human condition and his revolutionary approaches to education. His credentials were impeccable: a graduate of Harvard College with highest honors, fluent in Latin, Greek, French, and German, with published papers on classical rhetoric and moral philosophy that had earned praise from Boston's intellectual elite. At 35 years old when he first arrived, Drummond cut an imposing figure that commanded immediate attention. Standing well over 6 feet tall, he possessed the lean build of a scholar who spent long hours bent over books, yet moved with the fluid grace of someone completely comfortable in his own skin. His most striking feature was his eyes, pale gray, almost silver in certain light, with an intensity that made conversation partners feel as though he could peer directly into their souls. His hair had turned prematurely silver at the temples, giving him an air of distinguished wisdom that belied his relatively young age. Drummond's voice was perhaps his most remarkable asset. He never raised it above conversational volume, yet somehow commanded absolute attention whenever he spoke, Students described it as hypnotic. Parents found it compelling, and even Hadley's most skeptical citizens found themselves drawn into extended conversations with the new professor. There was a musical quality to his speech, a careful modulation of tone and rhythm that made even mundane observations sound profound. The professor's teaching methods were unlike anything the academy had previously employed. Rather than the rote memorization and strict discipline that had characterized the school under his predecessor, Drummond encouraged what he called introspective learning. He assigned students to keep detailed journals, documenting not just their academic progress, but their emotional responses to literature, their observations of human behavior, and their private thoughts about the moral dilemmas presented in classical texts. These journals became the foundation of Drummond's pedagogical approach. He would spend hours reading each student's entries, making careful notes in the margins, and then conducting private conferences where he discussed not just academic matters, but the personal insights the young men had shared in their writing. Students found these conversations both thrilling and unsettling. Thrilling because Drummond treated their thoughts with a seriousness no adult had ever shown them. Unsettling because he seemed to understand their inner lives better than they understood themselves. The Academy's enrollment had doubled under Drummond's leadership, growing from 42 students to 87. By the winter of 1824, wealthy families from as far away as Boston and New York began sending their sons to study under the professor, who was gaining a reputation as one of New England's most innovative educators. The waiting list for admission grew so long that some families offered substantial donations to the school in hopes of securing a place for their sons. Drummond lived alone in a grand colonial house on Elm Street, a two-story structure with 12 rooms that had been built in 1745 by Colonel Josiah Dwight, one of Hadley's founding families. The house came with the position of headmaster, and Drummond had furnished it with an eclectic collection of books, scientific instruments, and artifacts from his travels throughout Europe during his student years. Neighbors noted that he employed no servants, preferring to maintain the large house himself, and that he entertained no visitors. Living in a scholarly solitude that some found admirable and others thought peculiar, his daily routine was as precise as clockwork. He rose each morning at 5 o'clock, spending an hour in his private study, reviewing the journals his students had submitted the previous day. At 6 o'clock, he would take a solitary breakfast in his dining room while reading correspondence that arrived regularly from colleagues at various universities. Classes began at 7:30 sharp, and Drummond taught continuously until 3 o'clock in the afternoon, with only a brief break for a light midday meal taken in his office. But it was his evening routine that had begun to attract notice throughout the community. Each night at precisely 6 o'clock, regardless of weather, Drummond would emerge from his house wearing a long black coat and carrying a leather-bound journal. He would walk the streets of Hadley for exactly 2 hours, following a route that took him past the homes of the town's most prominent families. He walked slowly, deliberately, pausing frequently to observe houses with the intensity of an architect studying blueprints. Mrs. Abigail Hartwell, whose house sat at the corner of Elm and King Streets, had the best view of Drummond's evening perambulations. She later described his behavior to Constable Thomas Brewster. He would stop at each garden gate, sometimes for 5 or 10 minutes at a time, studying the houses as if he were memorizing every detail. He carried that journal everywhere, and I often saw him making notes while he watched. When I asked him once what he was writing, he smiled in that peculiar way of his and said he was conducting anthropological observations, studying how people lived in their natural environment. Other neighbors confirmed similar observations. Drummond would position himself where he could observe families through their windows during the evening hours when curtains hadn't yet been drawn. He seemed particularly interested in moments of family interaction, parents disciplining children, husbands and wives in conversation, siblings at play. His attention was so focused and sustained that several residents had begun closing their curtains earlier in the evening, feeling uncomfortable under his scrutiny. When questioned about these observations by concerned parents, Drummond would deflect with scholarly explanations about his interest in domestic anthropology and the social dynamics of rural communities. He spoke of writing a treatise on American family life that would contribute to the emerging field of social philosophy. His explanations were always plausible, delivered with such intellectual authority that questioners felt foolish for having raised concerns about what was obviously legitimate academic research. The winter of 1824 had arrived early and with unusual severity. Snow began falling in late November and continued intermittently through December, accumulating to depths not seen in living memory. By January, drifts reached the second-story windows of many houses, and the Connecticut River had frozen solid for the first time since the harsh winter of 1798. The unusual cold forced families to rely heavily on stored provisions and neighborly cooperation, creating a sense of isolation and vulnerability that would prove crucial to the events that followed. It was during this period of enforced intimacy and dependence that Professor Drummond began implementing the methods he had been developing since his arrival in Hadley: the long winter nights, the closed windows, the intimate family gatherings around hearths. All provided perfect conditions for the systematic observation and psychological mapping that would become the foundation of his most sinister work. The first family to disappear was the Chamberlains. Samuel, a prosperous grain merchant whose warehouses supplied farmers throughout the Connecticut Valley, his wife Mercy, and their 3 children, Benjamin, aged 12, Sarah, 9, and little Thomas, just 6 years old. The Chamberlains were among Hadley's most respected families, known for their generous contributions to both churches and their unfailing hospitality to travelers passing through the valley. Samuel Chamberlain had built his prosperity through shrewd business dealings and an almost supernatural ability to predict grain prices in volatile markets of the 1820s. His warehouse on King Street was always filled with wheat, corn, and barley, carefully stored in seed-aligned bins that protected the grain from moisture and vermin. Farmers came from miles around to sell their harvests to Chamberlain, knowing they would receive fair prices and honest measurements. His reputation for integrity had made him wealthy, and his wealth had made him influential in town affairs. Mercy Chamberlain was equally respected, known throughout the community for her work with the Ladies' Charitable Society and her skill in organizing relief efforts for families struck by illness or misfortune. She was a small, energetic woman with prematurely gray hair and intelligent brown eyes that missed nothing in her careful observations of community life. The Chamberlain house on Pleasant Street was frequently filled with visitors seeking her counsel on matters ranging from child rearing to care of the sick. Their children were the pride of the family. Benjamin, the eldest, was enrolled at the academy and showed promise as a scholar, particularly in mathematics and natural philosophy. Sarah was known for her musical abilities, playing both piano and harp, with skill that drew admiration even from visitors from Boston. Little Thomas was the family favorite, a bright, curious child whose endless questions and infectious laughter had charmed everyone in Hadley. On the evening of January 14, 1824, the Chamberlain family had appeared entirely normal to their neighbors. Samuel had spent the day at his warehouse conducting business with several farmers who had come to discuss spring planting contracts. Mercy had attended the weekly meeting of the Ladies' Charitable Society, where she had volunteered to organize a fundraising effort for a family whose breadwinner had been injured in a mill accident. The children had attended their regular lessons, Benjamin at the academy, Sarah and Thomas with Miss Rebecca Porter, who taught reading and writing to the younger children of prominent families. The family had taken their evening meal together as usual, sharing conversation about the day's events and making plans for the coming week. Samuel had mentioned his intention to travel to Springfield the following month to negotiate grain prices with merchants there. Mercy had spoken of her desire to organize a community social evening to break the monotony of the long winter. The children had been excited about the prospect of sledding if the weather cleared. Nothing in their behavior suggested any distress, any conflict, or any intention to abandon their comfortable life. Yet, when Mrs. Abigail Hartwell arose at dawn on January 15th to tend her kitchen fire, she noticed immediately that no smoke rose from the Chamberlain chimney, despite the bitter cold that had gripped the valley for days. Mrs. Hartwell, a widow of 63, who had lived next to the Chamberlain for over 20 years, knew their household routine as well as her own. Samuel always rose before dawn to stoke the fires and begin preparations for the day's business. Mercy would follow shortly after, starting breakfast for the family and preparing the children for their morning lessons. The absence of smoke from their chimney on such a cold morning was unprecedented and alarming. Concerned for her neighbors' welfare, Mrs. Hartwell wrapped herself in a heavy woolen cloak and made her way across the snow-covered yard that separated the two houses. The snow lay undisturbed, except for a single set of tracks leading from the Chamberlain's front door toward the forest that bordered the town's eastern edge. The tracks appeared to have been made by bare feet, an impossibility in the brutal cold that should have meant death within minutes. The front door of the Chamberlain house stood slightly ajar, unusual for a family that was meticulous about maintaining warmth during the harsh winter. Mrs. Hartwell called out as she approached, expecting to hear Samuel's voice responding from within. Instead, she was met with a silence so complete it seemed to press against her ears like a physical weight. Pushing open the door, Mrs. Hartwell stepped into a scene that would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life. The house was bitterly cold, colder even than the winter air outside, as if the very warmth of human life had been drained from the rooms. In the kitchen, she found the family's breakfast table set with their finest china, as if they had been expecting important guests. 4 bowls contained congealed porridge, grown cold and solid. 4 cups held tea that had frozen into amber ice. Most disturbing of all, the places were set for 5 people, not 4. An extra bowl, cup, and silverware had been carefully arranged at the head of the table in the position traditionally reserved for honored guests. Mrs. Hartwell had eaten with the Chamberlain family many times over the years, and knew they never used their formal dining service for everyday meals. The presence of the 5th place setting suggested they had been expecting someone important enough to warrant their best dishes. In the parlor, she found the children's school books lying open on the writing table, quill pens dropped mid-sentence, as if the young scholars had simply stopped writing in the middle of their assignments. Benjamin's Latin translation exercise was half completed, the ink still wet enough to smear when Mrs. Hartwell accidentally brushed against the page. Sarah's music had been left open on the pianoforte, a Buck invention that she had been practicing for weeks. Little Thomas's wooden toys were scattered across the floor in the precise pattern of a game interrupted, not abandoned. Most mysteriously, the family's winter clothing hung neatly on pegs by the front door. Heavy woolen coats, fur-lined gloves, knitted scarves, and sturdy leather boots. All the protective garments essential for survival in the brutal January cold remained in the house. If the Chamberlains had left voluntarily, they had walked out into temperatures that could kill an exposed human being within an hour, wearing nothing more than their indoor clothing. Mrs. Hartwell's screams brought neighbors running from all directions, their voices creating a cacophony of alarm that shattered the winter morning silence. Constable Thomas Brewster arrived within minutes, having heard the commotion from his house 3 streets away. A methodical man who had served as Hadley's primary law enforcement officer for 12 years. Brewster immediately began a systematic examination of the scene. He found no signs of struggle anywhere in the house. Furniture remained in its proper places. Nothing had been overturned or displaced, and no valuable items appeared to be missing. Samuel's strongbox, hidden behind a false panel in his study, contained $47 in silver coins and currency, a substantial sum that no thief would have overlooked. Mercy's jewelry, including a pearl necklace that had belonged to her grandmother, lay undisturbed in her bedroom dresser. The family's livestock in the barn behind the house had been fed and watered that very morning. Fresh hay filled the manger. The cow had been milked, and the chickens had been given grain. Someone had performed these essential chores with the same care and attention that Samuel showed every day. Yet he and his family were nowhere to be found. Most puzzling of all was the set of tracks leading from the front door toward the forest. Constable Brewster, who had grown up hunting in the woods around Hadley, immediately recognized that these footprints had been made by bare human feet. 4 sets of tracks, 2 adult-sized, 2 smaller, led directly away from the house in a perfectly straight line, as if the family had walked with single-minded purpose toward some specific destination. But the tracks told an impossible story. The snow was more than 2 feet deep, and the temperature hadn't risen above 0°F in 3 days. No human being could walk barefoot through such conditions for more than a few minutes without suffering frostbite so severe it would make further walking impossible. Yet the tracks showed no signs of stumbling, no indication of distress or hurry, no evidence that the walkers had experienced any difficulty at all. The search party that formed that afternoon included every able-bodied man in Hadley and several from neighboring towns, led by Constable Brewster and organized by Dr. Jeremiah Hedrick, the most educated man in the community. The searchers followed the tracks as far as they could be traced. The footprints led in a straight line for nearly half a mile, crossing fields and stone walls with mechanical precision, never deviating from their eastward course. At the edge of the old-growth forest that separated Hadley from the wilderness, beyond, the tracks simply vanished. Not gradually, not obscured by wind or falling snow, but ended abruptly, as if the 4 people who had made them had simply ceased to exist. The searchers combed the forest for 3 days, calling the family's names until their voices grew, examining every fallen log, every depression in the snow, every possible shelter where 4 people might have sought refuge. They found nothing. Number, clothing, no bodies, no sign that human beings had ever passed that way. It was as if the Chamberlain family had walked to the edge of the known world and stepped into nothingness, leaving behind only the mystery of their disappearance and the growing fear that something unnatural had visited their peaceful community. What disturbed the searchers most, however, was not what they found in the forest, but what they remembered from the days preceding the disappearance. Several men recalled seeing Professor Drummond speaking with Samuel Chamberlain outside Henderson's general store just 2 days before the family vanished. The conversation had attracted attention because of its intensity. Drummond had spoken in low, urgent tones, while Chamberlain listened with an expression of growing fascination that bordered on entrancement. Jacob Henderson, the store's proprietor, had been close enough to overhear portions of the conversation. He later told Constable Brewster that Drummond had been discussing what he called the burden of hidden shame and the peace that comes from abandoning false identities. Henderson had thought it an odd topic for casual conversation, but Drummond's scholarly reputation made such philosophical discussions seem normal, even admirable. More troubling still was the testimony of young Marcus Hedrick, Dr. Hedrick's 16-year-old son, and one of Drummond's most promising students. Marcus revealed that Professor Drummond had recently assigned a new type of essay to his advanced pupils, detailed character studies of their own family members, focusing on what he called moments of moral compromise and private struggles with conscience. Benjamin Chamberlain had been particularly enthusiastic about this assignment, Marcus recalled. He had spent hours in the Academy's library, researching his family's history and interviewing elderly relatives about events from his parents' youth. His final essay, which he had submitted to Professor Drummond just 1 week before the disappearance, had reportedly contained information about his father's business dealings, that Benjamin claimed would explain why Father sometimes seemed so troubled during his prayers. When Constable Brewster requested to examine Benjamin's essay, Professor Drummond explained that all student work was confidential, and that releasing it without permission would violate the trust essential to his educational methods. The explanation was reasonable, the refusal polite but firm, and Brewster lacked any legal authority to demand access to academic materials. But the coincidence troubled many in the community. Professor Drummond had somehow gained detailed knowledge of the Chamberlain family's private life through his student's assignment, had engaged Samuel in an intense philosophical conversation about shame and hidden identity, and within days the entire family had vanished without explanation. The connections seemed obvious, yet proving any wrongdoing was impossible when no crime had been committed that anyone could identify. The disappearance of the Chamberlain family was just the beginning of a horror that would transform Hadley into a community paralyzed by fear and suspicion. If you're enjoying this investigation into one of New England's most disturbing mysteries, hit that like button and let us know in the comments if you've ever heard similar stories from your own region. Don't forget to subscribe. We have many more dark historical cases that will challenge everything you think you know about human nature. As January gave way to February, the mystery of the Chamberlain family's fate became the sole topic of conversation in Hadley's homes, shops, and churches. Some residents began locking their doors for the first time in their lives. Others started traveling in groups, afraid to venture out alone, and a few began to watch Professor Drummond with new eyes, wondering what role the mysterious educator might have played in the disappearance of one of their community's most respected families. As the weeks following the Chamberlain disappearance stretched into a month, the mystery spawned theories that ranged from the rationale to the bizarre throughout Hadley's tight-knit community. The most practical residents suggested that Samuel's grain business had attracted the attention of bandits who had somehow coerced the family into leaving their home to access hidden money or goods. Others pointed to the unusual severity of the winter, speculating that the family had succumbed to a form of seasonal madness brought on by the isolation and cold. The more religiously inclined citizens whispered of divine judgment, suggesting that some hidden sin had brought God's wrath upon the Chamberlains. This theory gained traction when Reverend Moses Kingsley mentioned in his Sunday sermon that the family had missed church services twice in recent months, an unprecedented absence that some interpreted as evidence of spiritual backsliding. The Catholic immigrants, led by Reverend Patrick O'Brien, countered with theories about ancient curses connected to the land itself, drawing upon folklore from their native Ireland about places where the earth could swallow the living. Most disturbing of all were the whispers about Indian spirits and woodland demons, superstitions that rational citizens normally dismissed, but found themselves considering in the face of such an inexplicable event. Old-timers recalled stories their grandparents had told about the original inhabitants of the Connecticut Valley, suggesting that the Chamberlains had somehow violated sacred ground and been claimed by forces that predated European settlement. Professor Ezekiel Drummond seemed uniquely untroubled by the community's growing anxiety, while others organized additional search parties and held prayer meetings to ask for divine guidance in locating the missing family. He continued his regular routine with mechanical precision that some found reassuring and others thought callously indifferent. His evening walks never ceased, though several residents noted that his route had expanded to include streets he had never explored before, and his attention to the houses he passed had become even more intense. Students at the academy reported that their professor's teaching methods had undergone subtle but significant changes since the Chamberlain disappearance. He had introduced new writing exercises that required them to analyze the psychological motivations behind characters in classical literature, focusing particularly on moments when individuals chose to abandon their previous lives in pursuit of higher truths. His assignments increasingly demanded that students examine their own families with the detached perspective of social scientists documenting private conversations, behavioral patterns, and evidence of hidden conflicts or unresolved guilt. These academic exercises might have seemed harmless, if not for their unsettling specificity. Professor Drummond asked his students to identify which family members seemed most burdened by private shame, which appeared to be hiding secrets from the rest of the household, and which showed signs of what he termed psychological fragility under pressure. He encouraged them to observe their parents and siblings as case studies in human weakness, rewarding the most insightful observations with praise that made the young men eager to delve even deeper into their family's private lives. Marcus Hedrick, Dr. Jeremiah Hedrick's 16-year-old son, found himself particularly drawn to these assignments, despite growing unease about their implications. Marcus was an intelligent, sensitive young man who had always been close to his family, but Professor Drummond's exercises forced him to view his parents and younger sister, Sarah, through a new lens that revealed flaws and vulnerabilities he had never noticed before. Under Drummond's guidance, Marcus began documenting his father's tendency toward melancholy during the long winter evenings, noting how Dr. Hedrick would sometimes sit for hours staring into the fire with an expression of profound sadness. He recorded his mother, Elizabeth's habit of checking and rechecking the locks on doors and windows, behavior that suggested anxiety about security that went beyond normal caution. Most troubling of all, he found himself analyzing 12-year-old Sarah's occasional nightmares, wondering what traumatic experiences might be hidden in his sister's unconscious mind. Dr. Jeremiah Hedrick was one of the few men in Hadley with sufficient education and intellectual sophistication to engage Professor Drummond as an equal in philosophical conversation, a graduate of Yale Medical School. Dr. Hedrick had initially welcomed the professor's arrival, hoping for stimulating discussions about literature, science, and moral philosophy that would provide intellectual companionship in a community where most conversations centered on farming, weather, and local gossip. Their first meetings had been everything Dr. Hedrick had hoped for. Professor Drummond proved to be extraordinarily well-read, fluent in multiple languages, and capable of discussing complex topics, ranging from European political philosophy to the latest developments in medical science. He showed particular interest in Dr. Hedrick's knowledge of human anatomy and physiology, asking detailed questions about the relationship between physical health and mental state that demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of the emerging connections between mind and body. But as their conversations continued through the autumn and winter months, Dr. Hedrick began to notice troubling patterns in Drummond's thinking. The professor seemed obsessed with human weakness and vulnerability, constantly steering discussions toward topics like psychological manipulation, the breaking point of human endurance, and the methods by which one person might gain complete control over another's will. He spoke of these matters not with the clinical detachment of a scholar, but with an enthusiasm that bordered on excitement. Most disturbing was Drummond's apparent knowledge of intimate details about families throughout Hadley, knowledge that went far beyond what any newcomer should have been able to acquire through casual social interaction. During their conversations, he would make offhand references to private medical consultations Dr. Hedrick had conducted, family disputes he had witnessed, and personal struggles of community members that should have been known only to their closest friends and relatives. When Dr. Hedrick questioned how he had acquired such detailed information about the private lives of Hadley's residents, Professor Drummond would smile and speak vaguely of his anthropological studies and his talent for reading the subtle signs of human behavior. He claimed that careful observation and analysis could reveal far more about people than they realized, suggesting that most individuals were transparent to anyone with sufficient knowledge of psychology and human nature. Dr. Hedrick's growing unease intensified dramatically as he observed changes in his son Marcus's behavior throughout the winter months. The boy, once open and communicative with his family, began exhibiting a secretive, calculating demeanor that seemed completely foreign to his previously warm and trusting personality. Marcus started studying his family members with cold, analytical attention, watching his parents and sister as if they were specimens under a microscope, rather than the people he loved most in the world. The transformation was gradual, but unmistakable. Marcus began asking probing questions about his parents' past, their relationship, their private concerns and fears. He showed unusual interest in family financial matters, wanting to know about debts, investments, and business relationships that had never concerned him before. Most alarming of all, he started making observations about his family's psychological state that demonstrated a sophistication far beyond his years and a clinical detachment that chilled his father's blood. During one particularly disturbing conversation in late January, Marcus had analyzed his mother's behavior with the cold precision of a trained alienist. He spoke of her underlying anxiety patterns, her compensatory mechanisms for managing unresolved guilt, and her vulnerability to psychological pressure during periods of social isolation. When Dr. Hedrick demanded to know where a 16-year-old boy had learned such terminology and concepts, Marcus replied that Professor Drummond was teaching his advanced students to become scientific observers of human nature. The final alarm bell rang when Dr. Hedrick discovered that his son had been keeping detailed written records of these family observations, records that he submitted weekly to Professor Drummond as part of his academic assignments. Marcus showed his father several pages from what he called his anthropological journal, describing Dr. Hedrick's own behavior with clinical detachment that revealed intimate knowledge of his private thoughts, fears, and professional concerns. The journal entries made clear that Marcus had been systematically documenting every aspect of his family's private life for months, recording conversations he had overheard, analyzing emotional responses to various situations, and identifying what he termed psychological pressure points that could be used to influence family members' behavior. Reading his own life dissected with such cold analytical precision, Dr. Hedrick felt as though he were viewing his family through the eyes of a predator studying potential prey. Most chilling of all was Marcus's description of his little sister, Sarah, the 12-year-old girl, whom Dr. Hedrick considered the gentlest and most innocent member of his family, was analyzed in terms of her susceptibility to manipulation through appeals to her protective instincts toward family members, and her potential for psychological breakdown if subjected to sustained emotional pressure regarding her perceived failures to meet parental expectations. Dr. Hedrick realized with growing horror that his son was no longer simply attending Professor Drummond's classes. He was being systematically trained as an instrument of psychological espionage against his own family. The boy's natural love and concern for his parents and sister had been perverted into a clinical detachment that allowed him to study their vulnerabilities with scientific precision, all in service of some larger purpose that Dr. Hedrick was only beginning to comprehend. The scope of Professor Drummond's influence became even clearer when Dr. Hedrick began discreetly interviewing other parents whose sons attended the academy. What he discovered confirmed his worst fears. Every student in Drummond's advanced classes was conducting similar anthropological studies of their families, documenting private behaviors and conversations in detailed journals that they submitted regularly to their professor. The parents Dr. Hedrick spoke with had all noticed similar changes in their son's behavior, a new secretiveness, an analytical approach to family relationships, and an unsettling tendency to ask probing questions about private matters. But most had attributed these changes to normal adolescent development, or the natural result of advanced education. Only when Dr. Hedrick pointed out the patterns did they begin to recognize the systematic nature of the transformation their children had undergone. Professor Drummond had effectively turned the Academy's most promising students into unwitting spies within their own households, gathering intelligence about Hadley's most prominent families with a thoroughness that would have impressed a military intelligence operation. Every private conversation, every family dispute, every moment of vulnerability or weakness was being documented and reported to a man whose true purposes remained completely hidden behind a facade of scholarly respectability. As February progressed, and the mystery of the Chamberlain family's disappearance remained unsolved, Dr. Hedrick began to suspect that their fate was somehow connected to the systematic psychological manipulation Professor Drummond was conducting throughout the community. The professor's detailed knowledge of private family matters, combined with his apparent ability to influence student behavior so profoundly, suggested capabilities that went far beyond normal educational methods. But understanding the scope of Drummond's activities and proving any connection to the Chamberlain disappearance were entirely different challenges. No laws existed in 1824 to address psychological manipulation or the systematic gathering of private information. Even if Dr. Hedrick could demonstrate that Professor Drummond was conducting some form of social experiment using the families of Hadley as unwitting subjects, no legal framework existed to address such activities. More troubling still was the realization that Drummond's influence extended beyond his own students. Dr. Hedrick's investigation revealed that the professor had cultivated relationships with numerous adults throughout the community: shopkeepers, domestic servants, tradespeople, and laborers, who found themselves drawn into conversations that seemed casual, but were actually sophisticated intelligence-gathering operations. The picture that emerged was of a man who had spent 3 years systematically mapping the psychological landscape of an entire community, identifying vulnerabilities, documenting weaknesses, and perhaps conducting experiments in human manipulation that the science of his time had no framework to understand or address. If Professor Drummond was indeed responsible for the Chamberlain family's disappearance, he had achieved something far more disturbing than simple murder. He had somehow convinced for people to abandon their lives voluntarily, walking into certain death with apparent willingness. The question that haunted Dr. Hedrick as February gave way to March was not whether Professor Drummond possessed the knowledge and skills necessary to orchestrate such psychological manipulation, but whether anyone would believe such capabilities were possible in an era when the science of the human mind was still in its infancy. The very sophistication of Drummond's methods made them invisible to a community that lacked the conceptual tools to recognize psychological warfare when it was being conducted in their midst. The second family to vanish from Hadley disappeared during the early morning hours of February 23rd, exactly 39 days after the Chamberlains had walked into the wilderness. This time it was the Prescott household: William Prescott, the town's master blacksmith, his wife Hannah, and their twin daughters, Martha and Mary, both 14 years old. Like their predecessors, they left behind no explanation, took no possessions, and departed their home wearing only nightclothes, despite the brutal cold that continued to grip the Connecticut Valley. William Prescott was a man whose physical strength and steady temperament had made him indispensable to the community. Standing well over 6 feet tall and weighing nearly 200 pounds, all of it muscle-built through 20 years of working iron and steel, he was the kind of man who seemed incapable of being intimidated or coerced by any earthly force. His forge on King Street was the heart of Hadley's mechanical life, producing everything from horseshoes to complex farm machinery. What made William's disappearance particularly shocking was his reputation for unshakable religious faith. He had served as a deacon in the Congregationalist Church for 8 years, leading prayer meetings and organizing charitable efforts for the community's less fortunate families. His deep, resonant voice had guided countless Sunday morning hymns, and his steadfast presence had provided comfort to grieving families during funeral services. Hannah Prescott was equally respected, known throughout the valley for her skill as a midwife and herbalist. She had attended the births of over 60 children in Hadley and surrounding towns, and her knowledge of medicinal plants had saved countless lives during the frequent epidemics that swept through rural communities. The twin daughters, Martha and Mary, were accomplished seamstresses who supplemented the family income by creating elaborate dresses for special occasions. The Prescott family's disappearance followed an identical pattern to the Chamberlain. Neighbors found their house cold and empty. Breakfast half prepared on the table and bare footprints leading directly toward the forest. But this time there was a crucial witness to the events preceding the vanishing. Reverend Moses Kingsley had observed Hannah Prescott in intense conversation with Professor Drummond outside the church just 2 days before her family disappeared. The discussion had lasted nearly an hour, with Drummond speaking in his characteristic, low compelling tones while Hannah listened with growing fascination. Reverend Kingsley later described her expression as transformed, no longer the practical down-to-earth woman he had known for years, but someone experiencing what appeared to be a profound spiritual revelation. Dr. Hedrick's investigation revealed that William Prescott had also been receiving visits from Professor Drummond at his forge. Under the pretense of commissioning metalwork for the academy, Drummond had engaged the blacksmith in philosophical discussions about guilt, redemption, and the burden of hidden shame. These conversations had reportedly left William deeply troubled, causing him to spend long evening hours reading his Bible with unusual intensity. The pattern was becoming clear, and it terrified Dr. Hedrick. Professor Drummond was systematically targeting families using intelligence gathered through his network of student informants to identify specific psychological vulnerabilities, then exploiting those weaknesses through carefully orchestrated conversations that somehow convinced entire households to abandon their lives voluntarily. By early March, Dr. Hedrick had uncovered the full scope of Professor Drummond's intelligence network through painstaking investigation that revealed a web of surveillance more sophisticated than anything he could have imagined. The professor had cultivated informants throughout every level of Hadley society, from domestic servants who overheard private family conversations, to shopkeepers who observed customers' behavior and purchasing patterns. Each informant believed they were the only one. Each felt specially chosen for their keen insights into human nature. Mrs. Prudence Wakefield, the elderly widow who served multiple households as a domestic worker, provided the most damning testimony during her recovery from a severe fever that had loosened her tongue. She revealed that Professor Drummond had approached her in October, shortly after the first hard frost, offering payment for what he called anthropological observations about the family she served. What had begun as innocent details, who visited, whom, what meals were served, what letters arrived, had gradually evolved into systematic espionage, targeting the most intimate aspects of private life. He has a way of making you want to tell him everything, Mrs. Wakefield confessed to Dr. Hedrick, her hands trembling as she recalled their monthly meetings. He would sit in that elegant parlor of his, offering tea and speaking to me as if I were a learned woman whose opinions mattered. He asked such thoughtful questions about human behavior, made me feel as though my observations were tremendously important scientific data. Before you realize what's happening, you've shared secrets that could destroy the very people who trust you with their most private moments. The web extended far beyond domestic servants. Dr. Hedrick discovered Tom Patterson, the 17-year-old stable boy who cared for horses throughout the town, had been reporting on arguments between husbands and wives that he overheard while tending their animals. Sarah Mills, the seamstress who worked in private homes to repair and alter clothing, documented family financial struggles revealed through requests for mending rather than new garments. Even Postmaster Jonathan Hayes, sworn to confidentiality about correspondence, admitted to sharing information about letter patterns, who received communications from distant relatives, who conducted business with creditors in other towns, who maintained contact with associates that might suggest hidden aspects of their past. Most disturbing was the systematic nature of Drummond's intelligence gathering. Dr. Hedrick found evidence that the professor maintained detailed files on every prominent family in Hadley, cross-referencing information from multiple sources to build comprehensive psychological profiles. These files contained not just facts, but analysis, identifying each family's vulnerabilities, mapping their relationships, and predicting how they might respond to various forms of psychological pressure. Professor Drummond had constructed this network with masterful psychological manipulation that exploited each informant's deepest needs and insecurities. He convinced Mrs. Wakefield that her observations were contributing to important research that would help future generations understand human nature better. He made Tom Patterson feel intellectually valuable by praising his insights into adult behavior, treating a barely literate stable boy as if he were a trained scholar. He appealed to Sarah Mills's sense of justice by suggesting that wealthy families' private struggles deserved documentation to balance their public pretenses of perfection. Each informant received payment carefully calibrated to create dependence without arousing suspicion. Enough money to improve their circumstances noticeably, but not so much as to suggest anything unusual was occurring. More importantly, Drummond fed their need for recognition and importance, making each person feel that their particular position in the community provided unique access to valuable information that no one else could obtain. The third family disappearance occurred on March 2, following the now familiar pattern, but with additional details that revealed the sophistication of Drummond's methods. The Cornelius family, Jonathan, a prosperous merchant, his wife Ruth, and their son Timothy, aged 15, vanished after Jonathan had spent 2 weeks in increasingly agitated conversations with Professor Drummond about what the professor called the burden of inherited shame. Dr. Hedrick's investigation revealed that Drummond had somehow learned about Jonathan's father's desertion from the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War, a family secret that had been buried for over 40 years. Through careful manipulation of conversations and chance encounters with individuals who mentioned military history, Drummond had gradually made Jonathan believe that his father's cowardice was becoming known throughout the community. The psychological campaign against the Cornelius family demonstrated Drummond's most sophisticated techniques. He didn't simply threaten exposure of the family's secret. He orchestrated a series of seemingly unrelated events that made Jonathan feel as though the truth was gradually surfacing on its own. A casual comment about Revolutionary War deserters, overheard at the general store. A stranger asking directions to the old army encampment where Jonathan's father had abandoned his post. A book about military honor prominently displayed in Professor Drummond's office during Timothy's tutoring sessions, all carefully planned to erode Jonathan's sense of security. Just when we thought we'd seen the depths of Drummond's manipulation, the horror in Hadley intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what Dr. Hedrick found when he realized his own family was being targeted. The most chilling discovery came when Dr. Hedrick realized that his own son Marcus had been recruited not just as an informant, but as an active participant in psychological manipulation campaigns against other families. Marcus revealed that Professor Drummond had begun training select students in what he called social influence techniques, teaching them to recognize psychological vulnerabilities in others, and to exploit those weaknesses for what he termed anthropological research purposes. Marcus described assignments that went far beyond simple observation. He and other advanced students were instructed to engage specific community members in conversations designed to probe for psychological weak points, to introduce ideas that would create anxiety or self-doubt, and to report back on how their targets responded to various forms of social pressure. They were being trained as junior manipulators, learning to weaponise human psychology under the guise of academic study. The confrontation that would expose Professor Drummond's true methods came when Dr. Hedrick discovered his son preparing to submit a report that contained details about a family's secret so devastating it could destroy the Hedricks' standing in the community forever. The report documented Dr. Hedrick's private struggle with lithium addiction developed during his medical studies when he had used the opium based medicine to manage severe headaches, and carefully hidden from his family and patients for over a decade. Marcus had somehow deduced his father's dependency through systematic observation techniques Professor Drummond had taught him. The evidence was subtle but damning. The slight tremor in Dr. Hedrick's hands during certain morning hours when his supply was running low. His defensive reactions when patients questioned his prescribing practices involving pain medications. His habit of taking extended trips to Boston that corresponded with periods of unusual anxiety and irritability when his local supply was insufficient. How could you know this? Dr. Hedrick demanded, confronting his son in the privacy of his study at midnight. How could you possibly have determined something I've hidden from everyone, including your mother? Marcus' response chilled his father to the bone. Professor Drummond taught us that every human weakness leaves signs for those trained to recognize them. He showed us how to map behavioral patterns, how to identify the physical symptoms of various forms of guilt and shame, how to construct psychological profiles based on careful observation. Father, I can read you like a medical textbook, because he taught me exactly what to look for. The boy's clinical detachment was more disturbing than any anger or accusation would have been. Marcus spoke of his father's addiction with the same dispassionate analysis he might apply to a chemistry experiment, cataloging symptoms and behaviors without any apparent awareness that he was destroying the trust and love that had defined their relationship for 16 years. Further questioning revealed the full scope of Professor Drummond's training program. Select students were taught to become human microscopes, capable of detecting the slightest signs of psychological vulnerability in anyone they encountered. More than that, they were instructed in methods for exploiting these weaknesses. How to phrase questions that would provoke revealing responses. How to introduce concepts that would create self-doubt. How to manipulate social situations to increase their target's sense of isolation and shame. Marcus revealed that Professor Drummond possessed what he called his psychological atlas, a comprehensive manual documenting the precise methods required to break down any individual's mental defenses. The atlas contained detailed case studies from Drummond's work in other communities, step-by-step instructions for identifying and exploiting psychological pressure points, and theoretical frameworks for understanding human manipulation that were decades ahead of any published scientific knowledge. He showed us portions of it during our advanced seminars. Marcus explained with the enthusiasm of a dedicated student. The atlas documents how every person can be reduced to their essential vulnerabilities, if you understand the proper techniques. Further, he's proven that human conviction is infinitely malleable, that anyone can be convinced to abandon their previous existence if the appropriate psychological pressure is applied with sufficient skill and patience. The most horrifying revelation was that Professor Drummond didn't simply study human weakness. He actively created it through his network of informants and student operatives. He orchestrated elaborate situations that forced people into moral compromises, then used evidence of these compromises to increase their psychological vulnerability. He arranged for gambling debts to be called in at moments of maximum financial stress, ensured that old romantic indiscretions were accidentally revealed to spouses, and created social situations where people were pressured into making decisions they would later regret. The Chamberlain, the Prescotts, the Cornelius family, none of them were random victims. Marcus continued, his voice carrying an excitement that made Dr. Hedrick's stomach turn. They were carefully selected test subjects for techniques Professor Drummond had been developing for years. Each family represented a different type of psychological profile, a different combination of vulnerabilities that allowed him to test and refine his methods of manipulation. Dr. Hedrick demanded to see the reports Marcus had been submitting, and what he read convinced him that his son had been systematically documenting every aspect of their family's private life for months. The reports contained intimate details about Dr. Hedrick's medical practice, his relationship with his wife, Elizabeth, his concerns about their financial security, and his private fears about his professional reputation. Marcus had recorded conversations he had overheard, analyzed emotional responses to various family situations, and identified what he termed psychological pressure points that could be used to influence each family member's behavior. Most chilling of all was Marcus's analysis of his 12-year-old sister, Sarah. The report described her susceptibility to manipulation through appeals to her protective instincts toward family members and her potential for psychological breakdown if subjected to sustained emotional pressure regarding her perceived failures to meet parental expectations. Reading his innocent daughter analyzed as a potential victim for psychological manipulation, Dr. Hedrick felt a rage so intense it threatened to overwhelm his rational mind. "You've been studying your own family like laboratory specimens," Dr. Hedrick said, his voice barely controlled. "You've been documenting our private lives, our weaknesses, our most intimate moments, and reporting everything to that monster. Don't you understand what you've done? Don't you realize you've been helping him plan our destruction?" Marcus's response revealed the full extent of his psychological conditioning. "I've been contributing to important scientific research that will advance human understanding of psychological behavior. Professor Drummond says that sentiment and family loyalty are obstacles to objective analysis. He's teaching us to see human nature clearly without the distortions created by emotional attachment." The boy's transformation was complete. Professor Drummond had systematically stripped away Marcus' natural love and loyalty to his family, replacing these bonds with cold, analytical detachment that allowed him to view his parents and sister as research subjects rather than the people he had once loved most in the world. Armed with this devastating knowledge, Dr. Hedrick made the dangerous decision to confront Professor Drummond directly. On the night of March 15th, he arrived at the professor's house carrying copies of the intelligence reports his son had been submitting, evidence of the systematic psychological manipulation being conducted throughout the community, and a loaded pistol hidden beneath his coat. He was prepared to do whatever proved necessary to stop the destruction of his community and his family. Professor Drummond received him in his elegantly appointed study, surrounded by leather-bound books and scientific instruments that suggested scholarly respectability. But Dr. Hedrick now recognized these trappings for what they were, a carefully constructed facade designed to conceal the activities of a man who had turned human suffering into a science. "Dr. Hedrick," Drummond said, with his characteristic calm smile, "I've been expecting this visit. Your son mentioned that you had discovered his academic reports. I assume you have questions about the anthropological research we've been conducting." The conversation that followed revealed Professor Drummond as something unprecedented in Dr. Hedrick's experience, a man who combined brilliant intelligence with complete absence of human empathy. Drummond showed no remorse for the families he had destroyed, no concern for the suffering he had caused, no recognition that his actions constituted anything other than legitimate scientific inquiry. "You speak of these people as if they were wronged, Doctor," Drummond said, his pale eyes reflecting the candlelight with an intensity that made Dr. Hedrick's skin crawl. "But I have given them the greatest gift possible, freedom from the prison of social pretense and unexamined shame. The Chamberlains, the Prescotts, the Cornelius family, each chose to walk away from lives built on lies and moral compromises. I merely helped them recognize that their masks had become unbearable burdens." When Dr. Hedrick accused him of murder, Professor Drummond laughed with genuine amusement. "Murder requires a corpse? Doctor, I have created something far more elegant. The complete dissolution of identity, without violence, without coercion, without breaking any laws that your primitive legal system would recognize. I have proven that human conviction is infinitely malleable, that any person can be convinced to abandon their previous existence if the proper psychological pressure is applied with sufficient skill." Professor Drummond revealed that his work in Hadley was part of a larger research project being conducted by a network of like-minded individuals throughout New England and beyond. They were systematically testing and refining techniques for psychological manipulation, sharing their findings through encrypted correspondence, and building a comprehensive understanding of human mental vulnerability that was decades ahead of any official scientific knowledge. We are pioneers, Doctor, exploring territories of the human mind that official science lacks the courage to investigate. The universities concern themselves with dead languages and abstract philosophy, while we conduct real research into the fundamental nature of human consciousness. My colleagues in Vermont, New Hampshire, Connecticut, and Massachusetts have achieved similar results using the methods we have developed together. Drummond showed Dr. Hedrick portions of his correspondence with these collaborators. Letters that described refined techniques for psychological conditioning, improved methods for identifying vulnerable targets, and ongoing experiments in human manipulation being conducted in dozens of communities throughout New England. The professor had not been an isolated madman, but rather a founding member of an underground network dedicated to advancing the science of psychological warfare. The human mind is far more malleable than people realize, Drummond explained with scientific enthusiasm. Most individuals live their entire lives without understanding their own psychological mechanisms. They believe their thoughts and decisions are their own, never recognizing how easily these can be influenced by someone who understands the proper techniques. I have simply documented and systematized what charlatans and confidence men have known instinctively for centuries. Dr. Hedrick realized that any attempt to expose Professor Drummond through legal channels would fail completely. No laws existed in 1824 to address psychological manipulation. No courts would understand accusations involving systematic mental conditioning, and no authorities possessed the conceptual framework necessary to comprehend crimes that left no physical evidence. Drummond had operated in a realm beyond the reach of contemporary justice. Using methods so advanced, they were essentially invisible to his era's primitive understanding of human psychology. Instead, Dr. Hedrick chose a more direct approach. He revealed the loaded pistol and gave Professor Drummond an ultimatum: leave Hadley within 24 hours and never return or face the consequences of a father protecting his family from a predator who threatened everything he held dear. Professor Drummond agreed to depart, but not out of fear, out of satisfaction with his completed research. You've actually done me a service, Doctor. I have gathered enough data from Hadley to document my methods thoroughly, and this community has served its purpose as a testing ground for my theories. My colleagues and I have proven that psychological manipulation can be conducted with scientific precision, and we're ready to expand our research to larger population centers where the potential for impact is far greater. Professor Ezekiel Drummond departed Hadley on March 17, 1824, taking with him only his journals, his correspondence, and his Atlas of Human Psychological Vulnerability. He left behind no forwarding address, no indication of his future plans, and no explanation for his 3 years of systematic psychological destruction. The Hadley Academy closed within a month of his departure, unable to attract students after parents learned of their children's unwitting participation in his experiments. The 17 families that vanished during that terrible winter were never found. Search parties continued venturing into the wilderness for years, hoping to discover some trace of their loved ones. But the forest kept its secrets. Dr. Hedrick maintained his belief that they had perished in the harsh conditions, their bodies claimed by scavengers and the elements, though he never stopped wondering if some had somehow survived to establish new identities in distant territories where their manufactured shame couldn't follow them. Dr. Hedrick spent the remainder of his life researching the psychological methods Drummond had employed, hoping to understand how one man could possess such devastating insight into human weakness. His private papers, eventually donated to Harvard Medical School after his death in 1867, provided some of the earliest American documentation of systematic psychological manipulation techniques, work that wouldn't be formally recognized as a field of study until the development of modern psychology in the late 19th century. This mystery shows us how easily human nature can be exploited by those who understand its deepest vulnerabilities. What do you think of Professor Drummond's story? Could such sophisticated psychological techniques have existed in 1824, decades before psychology was recognized as a science? Leave your comments below and share your thoughts about this terrifying glimpse into the darker possibilities of human knowledge. If you enjoyed this dark historical mystery, subscribe and hit the notification bell for more stories that explore the hidden corners of American history. See you in the next video, where we'll investigate another case that challenged everything people thought they knew about the limits of human manipulation. The families of Hadley never learned that their loved ones had been victims of something science couldn't yet explain, a form of psychological warfare so advanced that it wouldn't be formally studied for another century. Professor Ezekiel Drummond had proven that the human mind could be broken not through violence or coercion, but through the surgical application of shame, isolation, and false hope. In 1824, there was no name for what he had become, no framework for understanding his methods, and no way to stop someone who could convince people to destroy themselves with nothing more than carefully chosen words, spoken at precisely the right moments to minds conditioned for maximum vulnerability.